Hello and welcome to Season 4, Episode 13 of Unlimited Opinions. I'm Adam Bishop.
I'm Mark Bishop.
And this time we are, of course, reading Alan Ryan's On Politics, a book describing the history of political thought from Herodotus to the modern day. This time we are moving into Part 2, or Book 2, I guess, of this work by Alan Ryan, which we're moving into the modern day, starting with Thomas Hobbes. This is kind of the first start of modernity, according to Alan Ryan, at least. What do you think of this chapter? Do you have any thoughts here?
I was thinking the other day, we have not referenced Tolkien.
We haven't.
In several episodes.
Yeah.
And so I have to figure out a way to work that in, not as obvious as I just did. Do you want to talk about the preface or not? I guess not really. It's
I mean, most of the preface we kind of get in the first section of this chapter anyway, I think. So.
Yeah.
But there was a preface talking about, where the divisions of the modern day essentially lie.
Is it Machiavelli? Or is it Hobbes? And this microphone is like slowly dropping.
I've noticed that. You had it pointed at your chin, which is like kind of where it's supposed to be, but now it's
like my belly button.
Not quite there. But
I keep
well, it is also, I guess, worth mentioning we are in person
live
for the first time in a while back home for Thanksgiving. So we'll do a couple episodes in person and back off.
Oh, by the way, yes, I do want to mention there was a review.
There was?
Yes.
Oh.
There was a, I forget. It was Podcast Republic is like some sort of website that has a bunch of podcasts, and we're on that. We're on all these different podcast places. And this was a review from a person called Disappointed. That was their, you have to put a name.
That was their name?
Their name for the review.
Oh.
July 10th, 2022. So it's recent.
Oh, wow.
So it would have been this summer.
Yeah.
And it says, so excited to hear a discussion on the great Joe Campbell. Instead, it's some mouthpiece of right-wing propaganda. Clearly no desire to understand Joe's philosophy. No actual talk about Joe or the book.
Which episode was this on?
I don't know. It would have been this summer, July. It might have been.
Was he reviewing the whole podcast? Oh, I guess he must have, and not a specific episode.
It was a specific episode.
Oh, okay.
I would think because, I don't know which one he listened to, but I'm assuming it's a he.
Interesting. That is fascinating.
It was 1 star. 1 star out of 5.
Wow.
Yeah, so because I was looking for other reviews and because we had talked about the best insult.
Yeah, I haven't looked into the legality of that. I don't know if we can incentivize reviews on platforms, or they might kick us off for prompting good reviews in a way.
Oh, well, I thought we were talking about giving a prize or a free T-shirt to the most insulting review. Really?
Yeah,
so I don't think they can't give us trouble for having bad reviews. Encouraging
I guess
bad
not.
reviews.
I guess not.
So this guy,
that is interesting.
Whoever you are, Disappointed. July 10th, 2022. You're in the running.
July 10th. He called us a right-wing propagandist?
Well, I'm pretty sure he's talking about
Probably,
me.
if I had to
guess. It's a faw. So It's some, he spelled some wrong, but it's a comment. It's some faw mouthpiece of right-wing propaganda. It was probably some episode that I started with a rant about some current event or something.
Absolutely.
And then he's like, what the heck is this? This is Joseph Campbell.
Yeah. We did talk about the book in every single one of those episodes when we were covering Joseph Campbell.
He might not have got that deep into it.
That's true. He might have given up after your first 10 minutes.
If I had some sort of fake right-wing diatribe at the beginning of the episode.
Yes.
We lost him.
That's one of our 2 listeners.
I had the opportunity this guy was really excited about a Joseph Campbell podcast and he just couldn't last.
That's a shame. Maybe he's come around to us. Maybe he's listening right now. And we apologize for starting off that one particular episode with a rant. No, we don't apologize. We don't apologize. Never mind. We don't apologize.
That's the last thing you do.
We don't do that
apologize.
That is true.
Especially if you're wrong.
That does make sense. But thank you for coming back, mysterious, disappointed listener, because I know you're listening now at this point, several months after you posted that.
He's trying to find a way to get us taken off the podcast universe.
I don't think that's true.
Well, it could be.
We should probably get into to the content of the discussion today, which is Thomas Hobbes. And he begins this chapter talking about modernity itself. And of course, he says modernity begins with Thomas Hobbes.
Don't you think he's one of the greatest modern philosophers?
Thomas Hobbes?
Yeah.
Maybe. Maybe. I don't know. I didn't really like a lot of his thoughts here. I didn't.
What, are you supposed to like everything somebody says?
No, but...
What do you mean like?
I didn't agree with a lot of it.
Oh, that's different.
Yes, okay. But he kind of compares Hobbes to Machiavelli, and he says Machiavelli was a backwards-looking figure, as he believed that what worked at one time in one place will always work, kind of pulling lessons from history and kind of coming to the conclusion that that's the way that things always have to be. But Hobbes didn't appeal to sort of this idea, but he also didn't necessarily appeal to the idea of progress necessarily being the one, thing we should be striving for. But he did have a clear sense of the difference between civilized and uncivilized worlds, and so he breaks from the past tradition of appealing to a universal natural law. So he says, civilizations aren't all the same. Some are more civilized than others. What works in one place will not always work for the end of time in every single civilization, which is interesting, and I think it's a fair distinction. I think that's a good place to split things if you have to split things somewhere between Machiavelli and Hobbes, I would say. You look like you might be disagreeing.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think Machiavelli was had a limited scope.
Mm-hmm.
What do you need to do to get and retain power?
Yeah,
and that has its benefits, or interests in that subject. But Hobbes was trying to explain, what created our different governmental structures or societal structures, like as far as the king or whoever's in power. It wasn't really a guide to how to manipulate that.
Mm-hmm.
It was, what is it and how do you describe it?
Yeah.
And then some talk of, the best type,
Mm-hmm.
I think. Do you think? I
think
there's
so.
a big difference, I think, between the emphasis, at least, between the two.
Yeah, that's a good point. That is a good point.
And
But I think the distinction he makes here is fair. Who's looking forward and who's looking backwards. I think is kind of this distinction he's making.
True.
As to what is modernity.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yes, which I think is, if you have to cut it somewhere, that's a good enough place to cut it.
I guess.
Yes. All right. Well, moving on, I guess. We move
I'm not arguing with you.
Yes. We move into the life and times of Thomas Hobbes, and Alan Ryan starts off this section by saying that Hobbes was the greatest of British political thinkers and the boldest, most exciting, and most compelling writer on politics in the English language. So very high praise for at least his writing style here. He had many opponents, but even they acknowledged that he wrote better than them, so he was at least a very entertaining writer. He was born prematurely on Good Friday of 1588 because his mother was so frightened by the rumor that the Spanish Armada had been spotted in the English Channel that she went into labor. He was born in Malmesbury, Wiltshire, where his father was a country clergyman who later fled his parish and died outside London after striking a parson at the church door. And an uncle later sent Hobbes to the local grammar school and later to Oxford. But his later relations with Oxford were very strained, as he engaged in many debates with Robert Boyle and John Walters. And the chancellor of the university later wrote a large volume attacking Hobbes's Leviathan and had Hobbes's writings burned in the quadrangle of the Bodleian Library. So Oxford did not like him too much towards the end of his career. Very, very much so, in fact, that they burned his books.
Well, and as the author points out, we don't even really remember the book burners, but we remember him.
Yeah,
Hobbes
exactly.
that being. I don't know why people burn books. We have these, like your mom reads these books that are like these suspense or kind of romantic suspense books or whatever, and they have a value. I haven't read any of them, but then she's done with them, and then what are you going to do with them?
Yeah,
and you can't really use bookstores don't really want them, and you can't return them, and what are you going to do with them? So I suggest we just burn them. They're like the fireplace. They're kind of like kindling, and it was, but it's kind of almost like a superstition that you shouldn't burn books.
Yeah, I can't. I would never be able to do that. Like, I really don't think so. I can't even give used books to a bookstore. Like, I have to hold on to all my books.
Yeah, but if you're just burning it because you're never going to read it again.
Yeah.
I mean, I understand the sentiment because I don't like burning them either, because it feels like it's almost like an evil act or something. Like you're destroying some. You are kind of destroying somebody's creation.
Yeah.
Even though it's like one of a million copies. And what else are you going to do with it? Bury it?
I don't know.
Put it in the dump, I guess.
Yeah.
That doesn't seem right.
Yeah, no, it doesn't. That's why I hang on to all of mine. I have a lot of books.
You buy different books, though.
That is true. I don't buy
Pulp Fiction.
Yeah.
Like something that you can just kind of read for entertainment and get rid of, like a little paperback or something. But our local bookstore is closing, and that's when we're usually kind of turn it back in for some sort of store credit.
Yeah, and that's where I get most of my albums.
Yeah, they're very sad day.
Very sad times. Yes, shut down. Very sad. Back to Thomas Hobbes. After Oxford, he became a tutor to the son of the Earl of Devonshire, who he taught Greek, Latin, math, history, and the accomplishments of a gentleman. And in fact, his first political work was a translation of Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War as a gift to his employer. Hobbes then sought an ahistorical science that would demonstrate the essence of political authority. So he kind of, was looking at all these works that describe politics, but they all appealed to history. He wanted something that was fresh, that was new, that could, have these new thoughts. And so in 1642, as the Civil War broke out, a work entitled The Elements of Law was published without his consent. Because the book claimed that Parliament had no case against the king, he fled to France and attached himself to the court of the Prince of Wales, the future Charles II. So he was very worried that Parliament was going to come and kill him, essentially, for criticizing them during the Civil War. And then after Charles I was executed on January 30th, 1649, Hobbes decided that the royalist game was up and that sensible people must make their peace with the government of Oliver Cromwell. He then wrote the Leviathan as a defense of absolute authority, and that subjects had a duty to obey and assist any regime that would guarantee peace and allow them to properly pursue their own efforts. And when the Protectorate offered amnesty and restoration of property to any who would swear allegiance to the new government, Hobbes then returned to England. And so at the Restoration in 1660, Charles II invited Hobbes to court, but after a few years, Hobbes fell afoul of the church as he criticized the clergy for corrupting the morals of the court, and there was a move to have him tried for heresy. And so Hobbes then moved to the country and died there in 1679 at the age of 90. And then Alan Ryan ends the section with what you were saying earlier. He says it was unkind of the University at Oxford to burn his works as the second best to burning their author, because Hobbes ends Leviathan with the hope that his doctrines would be ordered to be taught in the universities, from whence the preachers and the gentry, drawing such water as they find, used to sprinkle the same, both from the pulpit and in their conversation, upon the people. 3 centuries later, Hobbes is remembered, and the time-serving reactionaries who burned his books are not. So he's like, remember my books, teach them. They're important, and in response, they burned them. But at the end of the day, we don't really remember the people who burned the books, but we remembered the person who wrote the books, which is a nice sentiment at the very least.
And he mentions that that he would have rather lived in quiet times, because I think the fight between Parliament and the king ultimately resulting in his death. I think didn't they execute the king after they assumed
Charles
power?
I, yeah.
Yeah, and I kind of share that sentiment. I used to think, of course, I was young when I was young, and I used to think, I wish I lived in a more interesting time. The 80s were like a booming 80s, and there was no real excitement. I mean, there were some little wars, but they were little, they didn't affect anybody other than the people that signed up to become soldiers. And now I'm like, as the world is getting crazier and crazier, I'm thinking, maybe it was a good thing to live
go back to the
time.
80s. Yeah, exactly. Hindsight.
All the pandemic stuff and what did Tolkien lived in World War One.
He fought in World War
One. Fought in World War One. So that I'm sure influenced his work.
Yeah. Well, he fought in the Battle of the Somme. Yeah.
Oh. Was that did they have chemical warfare in that one? The Somme? Probably. It was World War One.
Yeah,
they
probably.
gassed so many people. Yeah. That's just horrible.
Yeah. No. Terrible.
The living conditions those guys had to deal with, all the rats and stuff. And
well, he wrote some of his, earlier Silmarillion works while in the trenches, in scraps of paper and stuff. He wrote down some of his ideas that would later become, 60 years later or 50 years later, whatever, the Silmarillion. Yeah. So, which is fascinating.
Yeah, meanwhile, when I was that age, I was writing notes to my future self in my notebooks.
In your notebooks, yes.
I mean, what a contrast in effectiveness and talent.
Very down on yourself this episode.
I'm sorry?
You're very down on yourself this episode.
Have I said anything else down on me?
I don't know. That was pretty down on yourself.
Well, I'm thrown off by a bad review. Actually, no, I was inspired by that. You know what? I thought, I'm not faux. I'm not fake right-winger. I'm a real
real right-winger. Yeah, there you go. Oh, man.
Anyway, I'm getting us all sidetracked all the time.
We were moving on to the section about the first political scientist after the life and times here.
I enjoy our in-person podcast better because I can interrupt you with
yes, and you could just
thoughts.
Say things. Yes,
because
much
otherwise
easier.
I'm silent on the other end of this stupid streaming device, and I can't get your attention. And as long as you're talking, it won't pick me up.
Yeah. What a shame.
And then the thought passes. The timing's bad.
The timing's bad. Moving on to the question of whether Hobbes was the first political scientist. But he himself claimed that the science of politics began with him. He says that the chief obstacle of the creation of a genuine science of politics before was the self-interest of scholastic thinkers. He said, they were interested in philosophy and history, and that was what really burdened them from actually turning to politics. They were really trying to describe other things that they were interested in.
I think there's some truth to that.
Yeah.
They're trying to find a universal precept of goodness and virtue and then trying to apply it to a system as opposed to really studying government and the relationship between the governed and the rulers. That's kind of almost like a science or a separate or more particular philosophy.
Yeah, that is true. He says Hobbes' life was deeply affected by two revolutions, the Civil War of the 1640s and the intellectual revolution associated with Galileo, Descartes, Robert Hooke, William Harvey, and Robert Boyle. And so this led him to think that any society in which there was any doubt on the location and extent of authority was doomed to civil war. So Leviathan spelled out the argument that the unity of state consisted in the location of an absolute and arbitrary legislative and executive authority in one person or a body of persons. And that's really his one big message throughout the rest of this chapter. So we need a unified, solitary single power in charge.
Well, I think, yes, and I also think that there ends up being one. Mm-hmm. We have a divide in the United States. We have a divided form of government, but you end up seeing a consolidation of power in a group of people. Now we have a constitutional system, but I think he's not only saying that's what should be. He's almost saying that's what it is.
What it is, yeah.
Don't you think?
I agree.
Because there has to be some final authority for what the rules are, what the law is.
Yeah, true.
I think he's right about that.
Mm-hmm. And this one singular body or person was known as the sovereign. This is the thing that has the ultimate authority. And it possessed unlimited legal authority, and subjects were obliged to obey it in everything that didn't threaten their lives or require them to deny Christ. But again, he does say that if they were required to deny Christ, they should do so because God would know what is in their hearts. So essentially, do everything that they say short of, them killing you, essentially.
Right.
Which is...
And then you're justified in doing anything to avoid that, including lying to the authorities, ultimately. Is what it says.
Yes. But I'm not sure if I like that too much.
Oh,
I like a Bill of Rights.
Yeah, I don't agree with any of that. That whole subject of you are a subject of the government, and you're supposed to do what you're told because that's better for order. And I understand that if you're in a civil war or you live through that and you think just do what you're told. Because all sorts of bad things happen if you don't do what you're told or what the sovereign says. Yeah, because revolutions are worse than a dictatorship most of the time, at least in the transition. Yeah, but I don't believe in any of that. I think there are certain rights that like as our Constitution says, you have, and it's up to the government to guarantee that you retain them.
Yes,
not that the government gives that to you.
I'm sure we'll get into that idea as we move on throughout this episode. But Hobbes originally hoped to make his name as a man of letters, but then became passionate about the new physical science and was really interested in physics and things like that. But he was really pitched into becoming a political theorist by the events of his time. This was not really his main goal in life originally. He just happened to be a good voice on the issue. And so Leviathan praises political science at the expense of prudence, which was Hobbes' term for classical statecraft, or the attempt to derive maxims of sound political conduct from analyses of history and observation of how people behave in difficult times. So essentially like what Aristotle was doing, what Machiavelli was doing, just looking at, past events, observing people, and saying, okay, this is how a state, functions. That is statecraft as opposed to political science. But he was also not an unequivocal critic of history-based politics. He says there still is some merit there. He agreed with Thucydides particularly on an attitude against democracy, but thought that history was put to dangerous uses in its advocacy for tyrannicide and popular governments. That was his big issue with people looking at these, like Cicero and things like that, advocating for tyrannicide. Tyrannicide is never acceptable in Hobbes's view. Right. Yeah, according to him. He thought that the other...
I don't know what would happen then if you really followed his rule. How do you get rid of a despot? I guess you really can't, because everybody's supposed to do what they're... But I guess but I guess they get into that a little bit in the future. He gets a little bit of that later in the chapter, but I mean, it would be so hard to follow this philosophy and then overthrow a really terrible tyrant. I mean, it would be tough to square that circle, except for that you'd only be able to really be justified if your life was dependent upon it. And it's hard to get to that point because you could probably always consent to whatever the orders are just to save your life. I don't know.
Yeah, true. But he did think that the other writers weren't really thinkers, but allowed rhetoric to substitute for thought. And that was his big issue with a lot of the past writers. His first political work was The Elements of Law. It was originally imagined as a much larger work of 3 parts, on the nature of physical objects, on man, and on the citizen, or De Sive. De Sive implied, which was published later aside from The Elements of Law, it implied that subjection to the law is inconsistent with liberty, and so states aren't really aiming at liberty. But this idea was unappealing to both those who believed in the divine right of kings and those who supported popular government. So he kind of alienated everybody with this idea, which is kind of funny, saying that there's really no good on either side. At the end of the day, the state is not trying to give you liberty. But his contemporaries understood that the Leviathan justified Hobbes' submission to Cromwell's protectorate. So in a way, it was kind of written, him explaining his ideas at why he was able to enter into this new, sovereign, essentially. If he's saying, you have to stick with your sovereign, you have to obey your sovereign. The Leviathan does allow for some answers to that question.
Yeah, because if one sovereign dissolves because another sovereign conquered them, then you just have to declare loyalty to the new sovereign.
Yeah.
What they say, when a queen dies, something.
I don't know.
So when you're sorry the king died. Long live the king. What was that saying? Something king.
Long live. I don't know.
Yes,
the king is dead. Long live the king.
Yeah, there you go. Thank you. Gosh, yes. I was completely drawing a blank on that. The king is dead. Long live the king.
Yes.
Same thing.
Yes. But yeah, he says, if the sovereign disintegrates, you may submit to a new sovereign. He says no sovereign is truly a sovereign if he can't preserve the lives of his subjects. So he does kind of have a qualification there for, what makes a bad sovereign. You're not really a sovereign if your people are dying all over the place, essentially. But he does say here at the end, Hobbes wrote for an audience that was used to thinking about its obligations and whose support made a difference to whether the government of the day could govern. They were startled, for instance, by his claim that a man who submits to the conqueror with his sword at his throat submits freely. This was not founding sovereignty on the right of conquest, a familiar move, but founding it on consent and describing the nature of that consent in highly counterintuitive ways. So he has a very mixed bag, I think, of good and bad ideas going forward from here. I do like some of his theories of consent, just the fact that consent was prioritized above a lot of other things.
Right.
But the way that he uses consent is not great in a lot of circumstances, especially the fact that, consent by the sword is still consent in his eyes.
Well, you said yes.
Yeah. You weren't lying to me when I had the sword to your throat. That means you made an actual promise there. Ugh, not a fan of that one. But then we move on to the discussion of the Leviathan and science, which raises the question of what Hobbes thought science really was.
I thought we were past this.
We are not past this. We're still moving through the chapter.
It's a long chapter.
It was a long chapter. It's like 40-something pages or something.
50, I think.
Yeah, something like that.
All right, Leviathan and science.
Yes. But what Hobbes thought science was is hard to say. He draws an analogy with a watch. Someone who knows how a watch works can take it to pieces and put it together again. And so kind of using this analogy, we are to take the state apart in thought, kind of, breaking down all the pieces and putting them back together in theory. And the science of state building is the science of the construction of a perfect state. But he does mention that an actual state will deviate from perfection. So, we're kind of looking at an ideal state in a way, but with the acknowledgement that an actual practical state will not function perfectly.
Very much like Plato in his,
his Republic and everything, yes.
Perfect form, and we only see it, we can only do it somewhat.
Mm-hmm. But he begins with an account of human nature. He says, what we desire and avoid varies from person to person, but the nature of our passions is common to all. And this is one of the driving factors in his ideas of human nature. Many of the Leviathan's difficulties have roots in Hobbes' methodological observations. He seems to lay down principles for constructing a commonwealth, but it is not practical advice. So, exactly how he's approaching these things is kind of strange. But he says true science is founded on definitions, or the imposition of names and the reckoning of the consequences of things, what these names mean for things. He says, even though there are different words for blue, they all name the same visual experience. So he says, if names are well chosen, certainty will be achieved, and if ill chosen, confusion and contradiction will result. So he's very much a nominalist, which I do not like.
I'm not a fan of that either. That's the same thing.
That was one of the big issues I have with Hobbes. I think there is some truth to that, me being a linguistics major, that, essentially when we're arguing about, philosophy and things, a lot of it does come down to what we name things. But having this idea of, all of the things that we decide are really just, names, and they don't really have any further meaning besides what we agree on, is not an attractive idea for me.
Right. Well, and a lot of philosophy gets bogged down in the names, but it makes sense that you have to establish, it's really a common language. What is it that we're talking about? What is this item? And then we can argue about, whether it's good or bad or what the characteristics are. So it's necessary to name things. But when you say, well, the things are just what we named them, I don't follow that.
I think there is some deeper truth there.
Right.
Like our names just
outside of the name, but exist separate from us, even knowing that they exist.
Yeah, exactly. Like if animals have an intuitive sense of if something goes from a height down, that it falls, but they just don't have the name of gravity in a way. Like it's we can perceive that action even if we don't have a name for it. Like it still exists.
Right.
But he says political science aims to be an account of what we rationally must do, supposing our ends to be as the theory supposes, and ourselves to be fully informed and rational. So that's kind of his baseline, assuming humans are fully informed and rational in the system, what is it that we must do? And that is what political science is.
Yep.
And then we move on to Hobbes on human nature itself more specifically.
This is a kind of interesting discussion.
Yes, I enjoyed this, yeah. It says, Leviathan begins with an account of human nature and the role of reason in human life. It begins with the premise that humans are complex physical systems endowed with sense, reason, and passions. It says, reason is not a divinely implanted source of illumination, but the capacity to calculate consequences.
Don't you think that's an important belief?
I think so. I do think so. I do think that there is something divine about human reason.
Really?
Yes. You don't think so? You don't think that there's something that is special about humanity having reason?
I don't know if it's divine.
You don't think it's given to us by God?
I don't know.
You don't know?
I don't think so.
You don't think so? I think so.
What do I think on that?
I think it has to be. It's one of the things that separates us from animals.
Well, Hobbes disagrees with you.
Hobbes is dead.
Well, he's going to be brought back to life. That's final.
According to him, we'll talk about that.
He's a mortalist.
Yes.
Then he'll be judged.
Yeah, maybe.
We'll get.
But getting into we'll get into mortalism later. Right. But he says here, kind of getting into this nominalist idea. He says the task of reason is to calculate the consequences of names. He says words get their meaning because human beings impose names upon experiences they wish to record. The term red, for instance, gets its meaning by being imposed upon the experience of seeing a red thing to remind us that the experience was like seeing another red thing. This is not a persuasive theory of meaning in general. It is particularly bad on the meaning of words such as if or and, but it yields results that Hobbes needs. If everything is body, the world contains only particular entities, but late medieval philosophy invented all manner of terms referring to properties of a more or less occult sort.
Are you going to read the entire book?
I'm not going to read the entire book. He says, where names refer to a suspect entity, Hobbes sometimes declare them unmeaning. Frequently, he makes the very modern move of analyzing them as the name of something else, the name of a name, for instance. So breaking down his sort of nominalist ideas, essentially everything that we see or name essentially is something that is agreed upon by society, and that's the meaning that it has. But I'm not a fan of that idea, as I kind of mentioned earlier.
Yeah, I think it takes the meaning away from the object. It's the perception becomes the reality. I don't agree with that. I do like this where he's talking about concepts of God. That you're not really describing God because God is unknowable, and you're just trying to describe, articulate the unfathomable importance of God or strength of God or power of God, infinitely good.
Yeah, he says essentially we're just
infinite. It means it's non quantifiable.
He says like the ways that we describe God aren't how God actually is, but are more representations of how we honor God.
Right.
That's kind of what he gets at, is that, when we say he's infinitely, powerful, that's just calling attention to the fact that he is, beyond all of our perceptions of powerful. And it's sort of an honor thing there, which is an interesting idea that I agree with, that we can't really describe God. He also says we cannot know how God wants us to worship him. He says what is important is we all do it in a way that we recognize as giving honor. And he says this has implications for religious liberty and separation of church and state, but also suggests that uniformity of worship is a good thing. So it should be an agreed upon form of worship, but really one form of worship isn't inherently better than another in Hobbes' view.
Yeah.
He also says that traditional philosophy must reduce its ambitions. He says there are no Platonic essences of things. He says reasoning is social as well as individual, and use of reason implies willingness to defer to others.
I think that's very true. I really thought that was a good little quote there.
Yeah, I agree with that. Like if
you're really using reason, you have to be able to be willing to defer to somebody else based upon their argument. If you're not, then you're not really reasoning.
You're just saying what you think, essentially,
Right.
or what you believe.
And you may be able to do calculations and reason, but to be fully reasonable and using true reason, you have to be able to be willing to defer to other people who may know more about the subject or may make a better argument.
Yes, I agree with Hobbes there.
Good point.
He says, if everyone tries to impose his own ideas on others or define words as he wants, reasoning is impossible as playing cards if everyone claimed that the suit in their hands trumps everything.
Right.
I liked that quote.
Yeah.
But I think there is like fundamentally a flaw with sort of nominalism that will inevitably lead in that direction.
True.
Like if you say if everything is based on perception, then why can't I say, well, my perception is just as good as yours,
Right.
even if my perception is objectively wrong.
Right. Like what is a woman?
Yeah, exactly. That's what I was thinking.
I mean, they've taken it to absurd lengths, but it's the problem. It's a logical problem when you get to those far ends of the argument.
Yes. And he says, we reason for the sake of successful living. This is Hobbes despised Aristotle's ethics and politics, and so his system operates on a mechanical, not teleological conception of desire and aversion. He says something within us drives us to or away from what we want or wish to avoid. He says the final end of actions is set by our desires, not by natural impulsion towards the good. So very much removing the Platonic ideals, the Aristotelian ethics from everything like that. You're looking at me with your hands on your hips. I don't know what is going on.
You're getting carried away with the quotes from the book.
That was not a quote from the book. That was notes that I took down.
You were reading a quote from the book.
I was doing no such thing. I don't know what you're talking about.
All right. Well, let's try to keep it more of a summary.
All right. Then we move
nobody
on.
wants. This isn't one of those audiobooks.
It is not an audiobook. If this was an audiobook, we'd be doing a very bad job.
I'd be doing an excellent job
At being an audiobook?
I could read a book.
But you haven't been doing that. That's what I'm saying.
If this were an audiobook, I would be very good at it.
I really don't think you could help yourself from objecting your own thoughts into whatever book you are reading. I think any audiobook that you would make would have interruptions every 5 minutes.
Well, no, maybe you're right. But,
I think yes.
But I definitely could see me emphasizing certain words and audibly scoffing.
Yes,
at some
absolutely.
You're right. You're
Yes.
right. I'd be terrible at it. Sorry.
He then moves in to good and evil. He says, whatever we desire.
This is a fascinating discussion.
Yes, this was very interesting.
I think he's weird and odd and wrong, but it's interesting how he viewed things.
Yes.
Tried to almost make it a logical, not based upon some moral philosophy. Just try to make it a practical argument of what is good and what is evil. And basically, good is what's good for me, and evil is what I don't like.
Yeah, essentially, that's what he says. He says, whatever we desire, we call good. Whatever we dislike, we call evil. He says, happiness consists in getting what we want, but he does say, we can later realize bad side effects of our wants and recognize that we were mistaken to want them. So there is sort of this acknowledgement there that, maybe you shouldn't want everything. But he says, success consists of satisfying one desire after another, and greater happiness is the result of satisfying more desires. Since we are physical systems, our desires are constantly changing, and with them the standard by which we judge happiness and misery, so therefore there is no ultimate good after which we will want no more. And with this, he
I
brings...
think this is more of a psychological rather than philosophical discussion.
Yeah,
He's not really talking about what is... what God would think would be a sin or a positive attribute. It's more like what we value.
Yeah. Well, it reminds me
think?
almost of Sigmund Freud.
Correct.
Kind of taking the idea of, this is our, innermost desire and
Correct.
things like that. It's something within us that just compels us to get there.
Yes.
And with this, he has this idea of the felicity of life, which consists in satisfying as many of these changeable desires as we can. So that's really what life is about, to lead a successful life. He also says that there are second-order desires, which are desires that other desires be satisfied and desire that other people's desires be satisfied. There's a lot of desires,
Yes.
but this is benevolence. The idea that I want something because somebody else wants it.
But
idea.
you want it for them.
Yes.
Benevolence, not I want it just because they want it, which is just, I don't know, jealousy, I guess.
Yeah. And so with this traditional doctrine of the common good is demolished, as there's no one particular goal and nothing that satisfies anyone forever. There's no combined goal that we're all trying to achieve. But pride is analyzed through this lens, and I thought this was interesting because he says, because the standard of how well we are doing comes from within, it cannot answer the question of whether we get what we should, and so we always look to what others have. And so therefore we come to desires like other people's approval. With that, we want, just more and more, and we want to be, viewed as good in their eyes because we're always looking at them and seeing how good that they're doing, which is an interesting sort of idea of pride.
Yeah.
He says, pride must yield to its opposite. We must consider what is most important, what our most important long-term interests and concerns are. And Hobbes insists on natural equality of mankind. There are no natural aristocrats. This is what it means to be an aristocrat. Isn't a matter of what the sovereign authority determines, which...
It's a pretty dangerous concept.
Yeah. And sometimes I think I do agree with that, but other times I'm not so sure.
What do you mean? Why wouldn't you agree with that?
I don't know, because I think that some people do have things that just... I've tried to find the right words here, but some people are just objectively more intelligent. I don't think everybody is born, completely equal. I don't think that gives them the right to rule over other people, but I don't think that everybody is inherently equal in their facilities.
Oh, in their facilities.
Yes.
Correct. I agree with that.
Yeah.
But equal value.
Yes. Equal value. Absolutely.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. I was just sort of get worried about it.
Yeah. No.
Okay. Well, I thought you were going to point yourself better than others.
Yeah. Well, maybe so. It says, although there is no consensus on the highest good, everyone has good reason to avoid sudden and violent death, and so death is the greatest evil. He says that's what we all agree on.
Yeah, it's like a universal. He says that's the universal bad is death, and I don't agree with that.
No, neither do I.
Why don't you agree with it?
Because I think, death enables, humans to accomplish things in a way. I mean, it's a driving force. We want to get things done before we die.
Oh.
Yeah.
Well, that would support his argument that you're so afraid of death you want to get as much in before you die.
But that doesn't make death a bad thing.
What's the end of all your good things that you've done?
No, it's not.
I think that my argument, which is much better than yours,
sure, that wasn't my whole argument.
There are some things worse than death. I mean, torture, like that old my first Chi-Chi joke.
Yes.
Should I share that with the
I think you've said it at least twice on the podcast before.
It's not that funny, man.
It's not. It makes you laugh every time.
And I say it all the time, but I only say the first Chi-Chi. Google it.
Yes.
You should be able to find the joke. But no, I mean, I think there are. If you live a dissolute life, if you live a life without any character, where you do bad things to people for your own selfish desires, I think that is worse than death. I think prolonging your life at the expense of others. Like if you have a choice between, shooting yourself in the head or shooting 10 children in the head, death is the only appropriate choice.
Yeah.
Because you could live, and so you avoided death for a while by killing these 10 kids. That's worse.
Yeah.
Don't you think?
I think so.
And so his argument is death is the ultimate bad, and I just don't think that's true.
Neither do I.
Okay, good.
Yes, but I was also
I've
thinking
convinced you.
I would have agreed with that in the first place before you had said it. So you've not convinced me of anything. But Tolkien has a good short story, short essay about death. I think I've talked
Tolkien
about this.
Doesn't have any short stories.
Yes, he did.
These are always like 500 pages long.
That's not true. The Opherbeth Finrod Andreth.
Oh yeah,
the classic.
Yes.
But it's the discussion of Finrod and Andreth. Finrod is an elf. Andreth is a woman.
Why are you explaining all this? We all know that.
Oh my God. But essentially, there's a whole bunch of other stuff in it, but essentially each envies the other because the elves are immortal in Tolkien's world and the humans are not. They're just regular humans. And so, the humans like, oh, well, why can't we just live forever? Blah, 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 blah. But the elf's like, well, no, that's a gift. We're kind of stuck here on this world. You get to go somewhere else. You get to experience the new and sort of stuff. And he brings up that same point that I was just making is, humans can accomplish so much in such a short time that these immortal beings can't because they're just driven to. Either by death or through other, attributes of humanity. But it's like, you're so successful in such a short span of time. The cities that you build would take us, hundreds of years because we have no incentive to work quickly.
I think that would be an incentive to torture elves.
What?
Because then they're super strong. They could be great workers. You just have to, punish them enough to get them moving.
That is not the message I intended to get out with that.
They just need the proper motivation.
Yeah, okay. Okay. Back to the book where we're done talking about elves. He kind of says that, we come together to establish a political community, not out of sociable impulse to pursue the good life, but out of an unsociable fear of one another and avoiding death. And so this is where we get this state of nature idea, the war of all against all. He says that men are rational and self-preserving and in touch with the physical world through the senses. He says language names experiences and allows them to record and anticipate past and future experiences. That's essentially his definition of humanity. And he says also there's this natural basis of religion that men come to believe in God through anxiety about causes. We're constantly trying to discover the cause of events that concern us, and so then we inevitably come to the first cause, which we call God. And so therefore we think of any being capable of creating the universe as very powerful and with our fate in its hands. And he says religion is a matter of law, and the priests of the Catholic Church are overreaching and self-serving. So a weird sort of dismissal of religion as just, we just want to find out what caused us, and then from there we get, different, religions and things like that.
Well, don't you think there's a certain logic to it?
Mm-hmm.
Don't you think?
I think so.
Yeah, I mean, there's a kind of a natural inclination to try to find the ultimate first cause of life, and so it's a plausible explanation of why we believe in God, and the religion thing is not the same argument, but you want to try to figure out God's rules. Once you establish that there is a God, you want to do what you think He wants you to do. Yeah. Yeah. So I think that's really his argument, I guess. It's not a bad one. It's, people make that argument.
Yeah, he makes a different point here that I think is completely ridiculous. He says, those who don't believe in God are fools but not sinners. If they don't believe in God's laws, we cannot punish them according to his laws, which I think is ridiculous.
Really?
Yes. I mean, if you're in a country and you're like, well, I don't believe in the laws of this country, and you kill somebody, you're still going to get punished. Like, the laws still exist, even if you don't believe in them. Like, that's what, to bring it into current events, that's what the Waukesha killer said.
Well, yeah, and you have the sovereign citizens, too. Yeah. But we're talking about morality.
Yeah, that's true.
Are we not talking about just you have to follow the rules because we said so? We're talking about what is a sin. Yeah. It's kind of like, do we think that people who have never heard of God or Jesus are sinners because they don't believe? Now, this is a little bit different argument because these are people that are atheists and specific, maybe had access to the information, they just choose not to. But if they don't believe in God, I don't agree with them, but I think his argument makes sense.
I mean, it makes sense from the perception of an outside person from that religion. But I don't think, but it doesn't make sense if you're a person of that religion to say, well, he's not a sinner because he doesn't believe in our God. Because I think, no matter what, if you believe in that God, it's a sin to not believe in that God.
But but then when you don't believe in him, is that a sin?
Yes.
Why?
Like if I used to believe in him and now I don't?
Yes.
Well, yes.
Why?
Well, because there are still Well, I guess to me it wouldn't, but people within the faith would see that as a sin.
Well, that doesn't matter what you think is a sin. The question is whether it's a sin. So let's say I wake up tomorrow, I'm no longer Catholic.
Yeah.
And I don't believe
Well, that's not going to happen.
That's just stupid talk. Is that a sin for me to change my mind?
Well, yes.
Why?
So to deny the entire faith? Yes. Why wouldn't that be a sin?
Well, I just don't believe it anymore.
Well, yeah, of course. What else would that be if not a sin? Well, how would that not be wrong?
I'm not hurting anybody.
Well, you could say that about a lot of things.
Well, not about a lot of sins. I mean, murder is a sin because I murdered someone. I took their life.
Yes.
Stealing because I took their stuff. I had no right to it. It's just in my head.
Well, that's still like... This is ridiculous. How can you say, if I used to believe in this whole religion and knowing that not believing in this religion is a sin, to step out of that, how is that not a sin for me? Well, are we looking at it from God's perception or from your perception? Whose perception are we looking at here?
Well, there's not a perception. Either something is a sin or it's not a sin.
Well, yes, that it's a sin.
Why? You haven't explained why.
Well, because... I'm trying to find the words for it.
Maybe it's because you have chosen to separate yourself from God and the relationship with your Creator and God, and you've kind of pronounced yourself above and beyond God's domain.
Yes,
and you're basically cutting off your relationship, and so it's a sin in the sense that it's hurting your own soul.
Sure,
perhaps.
But I think the very fact that you were like. Any belief system, if you're somebody who's like, I denounce that belief system, people within that belief system are going to see that as a sin.
But yeah, but that doesn't make it a sin.
Okay.
I mean, if we have a friend who's Muslim, and they're like, I'm not all into gay marriage, but I'm pretty sure we shouldn't throw them off a tower,
Yes.
Which is, some of the belief system. I'm not saying all Muslims believe that you need to murder gays, but it's somewhere in that book. Would we consider that a sin? Would the two of us consider it a sin if they left the Muslim faith and became Catholic?
Well, because the Muslims are wrong.
Correct. But what is the reason? What's the difference between that and a Catholic becoming an atheist?
Well, if I'm a Catholic and I subscribe to this entire belief system, and then I say all that belief system is bogus. I mean, it's kind of what you were saying. Then it's saying that
it's the same as the Muslim.
Well, yeah, but the Catholic knows that they were correct. I mean, it comes down.
I think it'll work on that one.
Yeah, well, I think it comes down to a lot of things. I think it's which is the correct religion question. I think in the end, and then you have to look at the merits of each religion, and is the logic sound? Blah 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 blah. Look at everything about it. Right. Then it's a matter of what is true. Yeah. And then I think it's because I'm looking at it in that perspective. Because I think
but his argument is a very good argument.
Yes.
And you were like, I think it's stupid.
I think it's still stupid.
It's not stupid.
I think it's still stupid.
It's a very clever way and a very unique way of looking at it. It's like, oh, okay. Well, it makes sense. I don't agree with it. But it does make sense that you would consider it not an immoral or evil act because you're kind of not bound by that belief system. It makes sense. I think. I don't ascribe to it. Yes. But.
Well, I don't agree with him, but he does say that believing in God is the safe choice. He says it's imprudent to take risks with omnipotence.
That's correct.
Kind of just Pascal's wager, in short.
Yeah, right. True.
He says mankind in the state of nature has the intellectual capacities of civilized men, but lacks government. He says the most important quality of the natural man is the desire for power. We are anxious creatures like us must want power to ensure the means of future self-preservation. Says we are driven to acquire power to protect ourselves, and if everyone was power-hungry by nature, there would be no hope of establishing government. But if nobody cared about his safety, politics would be unintelligible. So you kind of have to have this balance of, we want to help each other out in a way. We want to come together and preserve peace. He says the sources of power are innumerable. They could be strength, riches, wisdom, honor, but they're whatever allows us to bend other men's wills to our own. And that is his definition of power. Wow.
Yeah, and I like this. I don't think you quoted half the book, but I don't think you quoted this little excerpt that Hobbes believes secure people will not seek to dominate others, but insecure people will be forced to try for the sake of survival. So if you feel threatened, it's the first strike principle. As if you think that somebody's imminently going to hurt you or has the capacity to hurt you, you have to hurt them first to keep them from hurting you. And that's when we get to the next section,
which is war.
War.
And he says that
3 causes of quarrels.
Yes.
Competition, diffidence,
yes,
and vainglory.
Yes. He says the drive
that should be our T-shirt. On the back.
Yes. He says the drive to acquire
the
power.
Unlimited Opinions podcast.
Yes.
Competition, diffidence, and vainglory.
That's
like
lovely.
Script.
Yeah.
I should get that as a tattoo on my back.
You should not.
Like a big, I don't know, gang member tattoo.
That is a terrible idea.
Crucifix in the middle of it.
There you go. It's classy. He says the drive to acquire power is what makes government necessary. We need a common judge to divide our rights and duties and reallocate determinated rights that we can make use of. He says that in the absence of this judge, a war and conflict come about in 3 ways, like you said. The first being competition. And that if we are all anxious about securing resources, there's no mechanism to provide security, then we have to grab what we can at one another's expense. So very similar to Augustine's idea, in that, we're all just competing, and then out of fear of other people taking our stuff, which is the next one, which is diffidence or mutual fear. Each individual possesses the ability to injure or kill another human being. He makes an interesting point that even the strongest is vulnerable in his sleep.
Right.
Kind of this acknowledgement that we're all at risk to each other. Then we all have a reason to fear everyone else, and the only way in which we are safe from a person is by killing him. And the government solves this problem by being a deterrent towards all parties. So I think basically exactly what Augustine described.
True.
Very, very long time ago, 1,200 years ago, I suppose.
Right.
And the third is pride. He says, pride makes men overestimate their capacities and take foolish risks, which leads them to be obstinate when they would persevere the peace by being willing to give in. He says the cures for pride are that the sovereign is to be understood as the fount of honor, and social status is a gift, and to simply repress pride's expression as much as possible. Which I think is fair as well. If we all think that we're untouchable and we deserve everything, that's naturally going to lead to a lot of conflict.
Yeah, I mean, his argument is there has to be one sovereign above all of everybody else, so that nobody gets too far out of line. Basically, you get too big for your britches.
Yeah,
so the king will teach you a lesson.
Pretty much. He then gets into the laws of nature. He says humans are essentially innocent, but are frightened of death and do anything to avoid it. So everyone agrees that we need rules to make us keep the peace and fulfill agreements with one another, all a part of this idea to avoid death.
You didn't use my favorite quote from Hobbes.
Oh, what's your favorite quote?
That life, the state of nature is poor, solitary, nasty, brutish, and short.
That should also be tattooed on your back.
Oh no!
Maybe get that idea.
Get that on my thigh.
No, you should no. Abs, no. Oh, God.
Or get one on each limb. Wait, is it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then one on my forehead? I get brutish. I can leave off short. Poor, solitary, nasty, brutish.
It's lovely. That is lovely. But he says,
do you agree with that though?
Yes. No, I absolutely do.
I think a lot of human life has had those characteristics.
Yeah, no,
I think we're in a very affluent period of time.
This is one of the things that I do agree with him. I don't agree with Hobbes on a lot of stuff in this chapter, but I do agree with him that if left in the state of nature, life sucks.
Yes.
Like we need something to take us out of that really sucky existence.
Right.
And so this idea that we need rules to make us keep the peace and fulfill agreements brings about the laws of nature, which aren't really laws, they aren't really rules, but they're theorems about what conduces the safety of all. He says, they're conclusions. If we all do X, there will be peace, essentially, just using logic and reasoning to determine what's sort of the best course of action. He says the basis of the laws of nature is preservation of mankind, and the first law is to seek peace. He says, however, if others do not follow these laws, then it is dangerous for us to follow them, as we would be taken advantage of, and so it is important for us all to follow the rules. This idea that, there is this necessity that we all agree on what they are and we all come together because, if I decide, well, I'm going to preserve the peace, then everybody's going to come rob me because now I'm a pacifist in a way, to put it in simple terms.
Yeah.
But he says all of us are self-centered in a physical sense that is consistent with being benevolent, honest, and just. He says our desires are part of a system that attempts to maximize the flow of vital motions about the heart. And it's a necessary truth that we do what leads to happiness. So somewhat utilitarian, I think, in that, maximizing happiness idea. But with this, we get this idea of obligation. He says, while God can command us because he created us, earthly sovereigns are created by the consent of their subjects. This is one of the things that I do like about Hobbes.
Correct.
He says the second law of nature is to be willing to lay down the right to all things and be contented with so much liberty against other men as he would allow other men against himself. So kind of a golden rule, essentially, don't do to others what you would do to yourself. Lay down as much rights as you'd be comfortable with the other men, laying down for you in a way.
I was curious by his thought that he thinks that all injustice is inherently illogical. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that's true.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to get to that. I just want to mention, because we've got the first and the second laws. The third law of nature is that men perform their covenants made. So that, you keep your promises, you promise, second law of nature, you promise to, give up your rights and, have liberty against each other as much as you would allow. But then the third law is that we keep that covenant, essentially, in order to preserve peace. And that's where we get this idea of justice.
Right.
And justice, what he defines it as, is fulfilling our obligations. And because our obligations are imposed on us by ourselves when we make a contract or covenant, then it's illogical that injustice exists because we made those covenants or contracts in a way.
Right. I think he confuses inconsistent with illogical.
Yeah. Well, I think that's really what what his whole thing is consistency with the laws of nature is justice.
Okay, fair enough.
Yes. He says, in the state of nature, we make a covenant of all with all to establish government and create the artificial body that we call sovereign. But he says the difficulty in this lies in the willingness to obey the laws of nature. If it exposes me to attack by others, it is hard for me to lay down my right and enter into contract. So again, that idea of cooperation.
Right.
He says we need not observe the laws of nature if it is too dangerous, but we are not at liberty to ignore them as we choose. So it's not a pick and choose thing, but it's also if you're going to get killed for it, you can disobey the laws of nature.
True. There's some exceptions and extremes. Mm-hmm. If your life depended on it.
Yeah. He says, nobody is under an earthly obligation that he has not placed himself under. This is this idea of injustice again. He says, injustice consists of a breach of such obligation. He says that the sovereign cannot ever be unjust because, we've given them that power. They're not acting unjust in any way because we've agreed to let them do these things in a way, which is not what I like to hear. I agree with him that it rests on the consent, but just by giving that consent does not mean that the government can do whatever they want. Which is what I really don't like about Hobbes.
And I don't know if he really gets into it. I didn't see it. How do you revoke that consent? It's like once it's given, it stays with that sovereign until somebody takes it from him or it's been dissolved. The power's dissolved. He doesn't really have an idea or a mechanism to how you give up sovereignty. I don't know that he would conceive of such a thing.
Yeah. Which is a scary thought.
Well, and you'd think that he would address that, seeing how there was a civil war during his lifetime.
You would think so.
There'd be
but
a bigger emphasis on that. But he really just wanted to say, there was one sovereign, period, do what you're told.
Mm-hmm. And this is where we get this long, detailed description of sovereignty. I'll try to cut my summary short here.
Yeah, because it's a long chapter.
Mm-hmm. He says that the covenant that takes us out of the state of nature is for every man to transfer all their rights to a man or body of men and to take their word as law. And this is the sovereign. It represents us all, and we are the authors of its acts. So by entering into this covenant, we have created it, but it is above us all and represents us all.
And he believes that when we give up all of our rights to that sovereign, except for only our life. Yeah. And so everything else we're giving up, and we're hoping that the sovereign will protect our freedom of speech and freedom of thought and religious practices, because it's in the sovereign's best interest to be what do you call that? I'm terrible with my words today.
What? I don't even know what you're trying to describe.
Benevolent.
Yes,
benevolent.
Benevolent?
Benevolent. Benevolent.
Yeah, there we go. That was the word. But yeah, he does get into that idea in that, that we do have to have, obedience to the law. If there is to be obedience to the law, one body or person must have the last say on what the law is. Right. He says divided sovereignty is disastrous, and he kind of makes the comparison to the United States, like Hobbes would be fundamentally against the United States existing in a way. Like he is not about, there being, different definitions of what is legal and correct.
I think he would have argued against its creation.
Yeah.
But I think seeing it in practice, I think he'd probably change his views.
Maybe.
Because I don't think he would have had any concept that a divided government, and especially like the Articles of Confederation, which were 13 separate sovereigns cooperating like that, he would not have any concept that could work. Or even like the European Union now.
Yeah.
I mean, he would not have any idea that was even possible.
Yeah.
So I think that he would just change his mind, and it's really just kind of a version of what he's saying is that there still has to be an ultimate authority, and you can see the federal government asserting itself, and the Supreme Court just asserting that it has a right to decide what's constitutional out of nothing.
Yeah.
So I think that kind of supports his theory in some levels.
Agreed. But he does say that there are two kinds of sovereign. Sovereign by institution, which is authority created out of the state of nature, and sovereign by acquisition, which is when an existent sovereign acquires new subjects. But he says, both of these are sort of, the ultimate power in their given system. Just because it's a new sovereign over you does not mean that they have any less power. He says, the sovereign is not bound by any promise to their subjects. We give up all rights to a sovereign except the right to save our own life, like you were saying. They don't have to keep any of their promises. Yeah. We just have to keep ours. And no, thank you. That is not what I like to hear.
No, that's inviting tyrannicide.
Yes. Yeah, no kidding. But he says the point of the sovereign is to settle the question of what the law is in some particular jurisdiction. He says what makes laws is not their goodness, but their being, being led by rulers, being described as rules to guide subjects. So just the nature of them being prescribed by a sovereign makes a law a law. It does not have to be a good law, which I also do not like. He says that
it kind of is true though. Because if the power has the power to do it, it is the law.
Yeah,
I
guess that's true. He then goes into this idea that, the freedoms that we do have under the government consist in the silence of the laws, which is another concept that I don't like. He says, although governments are entitled to legislate on anything, they should actually enact as few laws as possible, as subjects with fewer regulations will be happier and more peaceful. So he kind of says, governments will just naturally do this. It'll be better for them, for their subjects to be happy, and so they'll give them freedoms. But that is not the case, as we've seen many, many times over throughout history. For
a guy who believed that the state of nature is one against the other, everybody against each other, to believe that there would be somebody that had the power of a sovereign that would not wield that power at their convenience is really kind of silly.
Yeah.
Don't you think?
Yeah, I agree.
Gosh.
He then goes in to talk about sort of the prosperity, the economics of the government. He says the government helps us prosper through protection against force and fraud, and helps us through commercial laws. He says laws about ownership and contract offer individuals the state's coercive powers when certain conditions are filled. So kind of having the state in order to back up some sort of commerce and things like that to help people prosper. Right. He also kind of sets up a very minimal welfare state. He says a prosperous society should provide help to the old, poor, and unemployed. And he says in an interesting sort of way that our selfishness can be benevolent. We help these people suffering on the street because they make us, feel bad. And so when we help them, we are helping ourselves fulfill our desires to not feel bad when looking at these people on the street.
The solution to that problem is just not feel bad. Really, that's the other option.
That is true.
It's really not benevolence. It's just a different form of selfishness.
Yeah.
You aren't helping them because you want to help them.
You're helping because you feel bad. Yeah.
It's like the Seinfeld thing.
I don't know what Seinfeld thing.
Seinfeld's the whole show is about these very selfish, self-centered people, and they would only give to charity if they got some reward for it, or feel better about it, or feel superior.
That is true. He then goes on to the Christian Commonwealth, because this is a big question at the time. And Hobbes felt honor-bound to fight off current theological views and to defend unorthodox views of his own. And one of these was the mortalism we talked about earlier. And mortalists believe that we perish entirely at death without continuing to exist as an immortal soul. And at the last judgment, we are created anew to be judged, and the righteous will be granted eternal bodily existence, and the unrighteous will just cease to exist. In this, we also get this idea of the idea that religion grew out of anxiety and that we're just searching for causes of things. But he says that religion is more important as a social practice than as intellectual speculation, and so must be regulated with a view to preserving peace and security. He says, the government should crack down on, modern day prophets. He says prophets ceased when God ceased to provide them with miraculous powers. And so modern prophets have just dreamed that God spoke to them. And anyone attempting to set up a godly kingdom on earth would rightly be jailed, as they would be a threat to peace. Mm-hmm. So kind of arguing that we need a consistent, after that, arguing that we need a very consistent doctrine. And this doctrine was for the sovereign to decide. And the sensible sovereign avoids causing people anxiety by requiring them to profess beliefs that stretch credulity or came into conflict with other beliefs. So having some sort of uniform belief, but also some sort of tolerance of other religions is kind of mixed together in a weird bag, which I don't like the government being in charge of religion at all. Right. Another thing that I disagree with Hobbes. He also says explicitly that the Bible receives its authority from the sovereign. Right. The Bible only has authority because the sovereign says so. It's like, ugh, I don't like that. He also says that the Christian Commonwealth, to get to the original question, the Christian Commonwealth is just the one in which the sovereign has authority over doctrine, and this authority over doctrine extends to authority over Christian churches, and he prioritizes state over church. So I think this is the very first time that we've seen this very explicitly in a political system, that the state has control over the church rather than the church having control over the state, which is revolutionary in a way, but it's not something that I agree with.
Well, it was maybe the first of the philosophers that we've looked at. I mean, certainly kings, individual kings have asserted that authority over the church.
But it was the first time it was set up like in a full political system that the state has priority over the church.
Correct. As opposed to, hey, I want this power, or our guy wants the power.
Yeah.
Type of thing.
He also ends this section on Christian Commonwealth by saying, no subject has the right to challenge the sovereign on religious grounds, and we can deny Christ again to save our lives because God knows our hearts.
Yeah. Yeah. Which is kind of an interesting discussion, like those martyrs in the Colosseum. Would it really have made God angry if they said, "No, we're not Christians"? I don't know.
I think it would have made him a lesser person. I don't know if it would necessarily be a sin.
Yeah, I don't know. Well, I guess it makes him such a great, strong character person to be willing to risk it.
Yeah.
So I guess I don't like to frame it as they would be a lesser person.
Because I know at least
I wouldn't blame them.
Yeah, well, that's true. I think they would be.
I don't know what I would do.
Yeah.
I really don't. I really have no idea what I would do if somebody threatened to kill me. Under those circumstances, if I had the balls to say, "No, I'm Catholic," pull the trigger.
Because I know, at least according to the Catholic Church, like the definition of a sin is made, knowing that it's a sin. And with your own free will. Right. And if you're being coerced into saying something, then that's not really a sin because it wasn't of your own free will. It's like, do this or die. It's like, well, I was kind of forced into that.
Still have the capacity. Well, I hope I still have the capacity to make the decision. I just don't know what decision I'd make. I mean, quite frankly, I don't think any of us would know under the circumstances, but I don't know.
Let's not test it.
No.
Anytime soon.
Let's find somebody. Put a gun to my head. It may happen sooner or later.
Hopefully. No, maybe we get another bad review. Somebody will come hunt us down. It's right-wing hacks. We then move into the conclusion. It's just kind of summarized.
Yeah, it's just a summary.
Yeah. A little bit. But he says, Hobbes consistently argued for a state whose authority is unlimited, but exercises that authority discreetly. He defended the authority of the state over the church, and religion is a question of law, not truth. This is kind of unsure of how much of this was religious skepticism. He says the rational sovereign aligns his interests with those of his subjects, which leads to mutual peace and happiness, but the problem arises with an incompetent sovereign driven by whims, pride, ambition, or discord. And so this is kind of where he touches on the question of what to do about a bad ruler, but not really. He says we may resist the sovereign on our own behalf alone if we are directly threatened. However, subjects of a Hobbesian sovereign cannot help asking whether the sovereign may turn from protecting them to attacking them. So Hobbes says we should give the sovereign the benefit of the doubt. The sovereign must remember their glory rests on the prosperity and happiness of their subjects. It's kind of ending with this idea that, well, let's just trust the sovereign, that he's doing the right thing. And, if he does try to kill us, then we can resist. But even then, it's an iffy question of, well, he's still in charge. He's still the sovereign with all the authority. Are we in the right? Are we in the wrong? And he doesn't really answer that question to any satisfactory degree.
and I completely and wholeheartedly disagree that our rulers deserve any benefit of the doubt.
Yeah.
Quite the opposite. And one of my, I won't even say, I don't know if I say one of my favorite columnists is, of course, I'm conservative. And,
a right wing, faux right wing.
Faux right wing conservative. But his argument about Trump is that we don't owe him anything, and I think people forget that. Like, they think, well, he was wronged in this and that, and they've been fairly demonized. And I get those arguments, but we don't owe him anything. He owes us. We gave him the position of president, and he asked for it. We gave it to him, and we don't owe him anything this go around until he proves it to us. So I don't agree with Hobbes that we have to defer or give the benefit of the doubt to our rulers. They need to give the benefit of the doubt to us.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or else.
I think we should naturally doubt our rulers. I think in any given circumstance, it is better to doubt them than it is to believe that they are doing good things.
Right. And you have to set up controls. Otherwise, just by the human nature, the state of nature, the person that believes in chaos and mutually assured destruction type theories, it doesn't make sense that you set up a system where you'd have a sovereign that have control over you.
Yeah.
So his philosophy, I think, is a strong argument about the state of nature, is a strong argument for the constitutional republic set up by the Americans.
Yeah.
And I think there's some influence on that.
Yeah.
They definitely knew of Hobbes and Locke and all those guys were
Absolutely.
They knew all that stuff when they were forming the Constitution. In addition to they all read Cicero and knew a lot of the ancient Greek stuff, but the democracies and all that stuff.
Yeah, I feel like Hobbes is very contradictory of himself. Like, he tries to set up a consistent system that's like wholly original, but in doing so, he just, I think, misses the point completely in trying to stick to his own logic that kind of contradicts it. Because I think especially when you look at like the nominalism aspect of everything, if everything is truly just, agreed upon names, then, what does a contract even mean, to the extent that we agree to it? I could say, well, I didn't really agree to it at that time. It wasn't, in my belief that this is what we agreed to. And then the contract's null and void because I didn't really agree to it in my own perception of things. And it's like...
Yeah, that's when the sovereign tells you, well, no, this is what it means, and you're going to do it or else.
Yeah, which I guess is his argument.
Yeah,
but
it is. That the sovereign is the ultimate decider on what the words mean. And we as a society have to kind of come to some sort of agreement. If we don't, then the sovereign's going to tell us.
Yeah. Which, very, very authoritarian. I'm not a fan of
true.
authoritarianism. You can quote me on that.
Oh, can I?
Yes. Yeah, you can. Do you have any other?
Should we put that on the T-shirt? I'm not a fan of authoritarianism.
Maybe that'll be the quote on the back. But yeah, I was telling you off camera, off microphone,
off
I guess.
Off camera.
Off camera.
Wait, turn it back on.
Yeah.
Okay, wave.
Yeah. They can all see us now.
I almost got you to wave.
You almost did. I almost waved. There's no camera in here. It's ridiculous.
You actually raised your hand. That's great.
But I was saying I'm back home for a week for Thanksgiving. I'm going to try to throw together a T-shirt design, and we'll have another competition, perhaps some sort of review-based competition. Whoever, I don't know if insult is the best way to go. I don't know if that'll
most cleverest.
Yes, most interesting. How about that? Most interesting review. We'll scour all the places that our podcast is hosted on, look at all the reviews, and whoever writes us the most interesting review will win a T-shirt representing season 3 and 4, and that gives you a good opportunity to follow us on Twitter at ULMTD Opinions. All the information about this T-shirt giveaway will be there. I'll probably also put a picture of the T-shirt design as I'm making it and things like that. So all of our millions of fans out there can win a free T-shirt by leaving us the most interesting review. We're not asking for good reviews necessarily. We're also not asking for bad reviews. You're asking for. Don't just defame us on the internet. I would keep slander out of the picture, please. Well, I guess in print it's libel, isn't it? No.
I should know this. Libel is print. Slander is
spoken. Yeah.
And defamation is both.
Yes.
It's like the square is a rectangle.
Yeah. Yep.
Because the rectangle is a more broad category. Defamation is all that stuff. Defamation is a false statement that causes some sort of injury.
Yes. I thought you were giving an example of defamation, that a square is not a rectangle.
No, because truth is a defense to defamation.
Yeah, but back to the original point. Follow us on Twitter. You'll get all the information about the T-shirt giveaway. Leave us interesting reviews. Just don't say that we're neo-Nazis or something on the internet and get us taken down in a review. That's libel.
Oh, yeah.
That's the point I was making.
I'll sue you.
Yeah, well, There we go.
Your insults have to be insulting and accurate.
Yes. So you're going to sue that guy because you're a real right wing, a mouthpiece.
That's his opinion.
That's his opinion. Yeah. Don't libel us. That's the moral
You're really
of the story.
afraid that people will have
I'm just
like 1-star reviews and insult us, aren't you? You really want to have good reviews? I
don't care.
No, we should encourage. You're right. We should encourage honest. Because if they're listening this far, an hour deep into this thing,
yes,
they have
hour
to
15.
They have to be a fan. So don't just make up bad things about us. If you really like us, put in good comments.
There we go. That's yes.
But insult that reviewer. All right, the first one to insult that reviewer. No, that's a good. No, it's not.
We do not promote that.
All right. How about this? The first one that gives us the name and address of that reviewer.
No.
Oh, no?
That was a joke for legal reasons. That was a joke. Oh, God. All right. Do you have any other comments on Hobbes, the T-shirt giveaway? All right. Well, this has been Season 4, Episode 13 of Unlimited Opinions. I've been Adam Bishop.
I'm still Mark Bishop.
Thank you for listening. That was ridiculous.
Yes.
All right.